So I'll start. This is my dad. This is Bill, or I guess you could introduce yourself and your background.
Yes, I'm a longtime educator and have been involved with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for a number of years, working with them and Meyer Memorial Trust. And so I do have some background in education.
So I wanted to do the critical reflection with my dad because he has a particular, like, decades and decades of experience in this field. And uniquely, a lot of his experience is before any of the culturally responsive teaching, like, framework was written by Billings, etc. But for code switching, I know that you already had some examples in mind to talk about. So, she already knows what code switching is. We don't really need to go into the background of that. But what were the examples that first came to your mind?
Well, I think we see it all the time, and I think once again with people that represent minority populations are put in that situation often where they have to present in different ways in order to be accepted or maybe fit, whether it's in a job or maybe in the classroom as a student, maybe the only African American student or Latino. So I think that happens frequently. I was just listening to NPR, National Public Radio, recently, and they were talking about code switching with J.D. Vance, the new presidential nominee, and how he was so good at code switching in that he was able to relate to the extreme conservative viewpoints, but then he could switch and move to the more moderate, and you didn't always see quite the same person depending on who the audience was. And then a more recent example that I had. Hang on just a second. I was listening to a program on television the other night, and it was a Latino newscaster who, when he presents his newscast, it's in perfect English and presents as not necessarily as Latino, although you would recognize that he is, but Carlos Santana was his interviewee, and I just noticed as he went from his newscast to his interview with Carlos Santana, immediately switched the way he spoke and the mannerisms that he used that were more specific to his Latino culture and language. So those are just some examples that I noticed recently.
No, with the J.D. Vance one, the really interesting thing that stood out to me that we didn't talk about, I don't think anybody brought up in class, was that white people can code switch as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's something that we didn't bring up at all, but that's a good point. And even educators, I think, code switch naturally. They have their code in the classroom, and then they have how they are outside of the classroom. And I think that's just a small scale example that a lot of the teachers would recognize is you don't act the same way in the classroom you do outside, do you? But that's
no, I think that's absolutely true.
And then I'm sure we'll see a lot more examples of code switching on that VP breaking into the spotlight conversation with Harris. I'm sure she'll have to do quite a bit of that as well to do that same thing J.D. Vance did.
I think where it's really problematic and challenging is in the classroom where you're a minority student and you want to fit in and you're continually trying to figure out how that is going to work. And then you go back to your family or your home or your friends, and you're a very different kind of person. And I think the question that comes up is how can you be your authentic self all the time? And the answer is probably You can't.
Yeah. And that's also interesting because I've talked a lot in the class about Stand and Deliver, that movie that I'm a huge fan of. And in one of the scenes, a kid who doesn't want to be seen he's like always trying to hate math and be hard in front of his friends, because he's part of their gang affiliation. But eventually the teacher breaks through to him and he privately asks the teacher if they can go to the library and get an extra book so he can keep one at home and one in his locker so kids don't see him carrying it around.
Yeah.
And that, is that another example of that code switch to where how can teachers make that environment where they can act the same way that those friends, would be acting, but also get the accomplishments they need in school. And for the sake of not turning, because I'm pretty sure we could easily turn this into like a 30-minute video, and then the professor would hate me for having to watch the whole
Sure
thing.
we could.
But with that, those were good enough examples that we can move on to the more culturally responsive teaching side. And really, the thing that stood out to me reading the article and then having a chance to talk to you was the line about how over 2 decades ago, Gloria Ladson Billings, who's been popular and really common in our class, introduced the term culturally relevant pedagogy to describe a form of teaching that calls for engaging learners whose experiences and cultures are traditionally excluded from mainstream settings. Now, the question was that you did most of your teaching over 2 decades ago. That's where a bulk of your in-class experience, with a public school education setting is. So this is before Gladson Billings framework. Was there any sort of culturally responsive pedagogy that was implicitly there when you were teaching, or?
Well, most of my teaching was in Southern California, so on the east side of Los Angeles, and so I always have a very diverse classroom, and it was there was not a lot of material or methodology that was specific to culturally responsive teaching. But you kind of had to create your own, and being where there was a large Latino community, and being a history teacher, I had to go out and actually live for a week in Ensenada, Mexico, and be able to experience their school setting, and I also took numerous trips to Mexico and gathered material and photos and figured out how to create more relevance.
So not only did I not know that story somehow, that's a completely new story to me. I didn't know you ever did. How many other teachers back then did things like that to prepare for?
Well, I'm not sure there were many. I also crafted a course in the history of Mexico in the Southwest, and it was really popular because there wasn't anything like that. So, but there was really an effort toward bilingual, bicultural teaching, but it wasn't so inclusive. It was more an old school way of getting kids to transition from their native language to English.
So it was basically up to you to pull off the culturally responsive teaching as opposed to the system, or
it was not the curriculum.
Yeah. And there's another question do you want to share, because it is relevant, your infamous story about your first, I'm trying to remember where it was, and I don't want to spoil it before you tell it, but I think you know what story I'm talking about, where you were in the middle of a big kerfuffle.
Oh, that was well, I'm not sure how relevant that is, but are you talking about the riot?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just because that shows the exposure that you had to.
Well, there was a lot of social unrest. It was during La Raza, and so we had one day just had a break in the morning, and the students gathered outside in the courtyard, and the was a fight that broke out a ways away from me, and I was standing in the middle of a number of students, just talking to students out in the courtyard, and all of a sudden, the whole mass of students, this was a campus of about 2,000 students, and about a mass of students started moving toward the fight, and I all of a sudden just went down because of the press of bodies, and people were coming over the top of me, and I couldn't even get up, and pretty soon there were police helicopters overhead, and the riot was stopped, but it was a really wake-up call.
That's why I thought that would be a good, just relevant example that you weren't teaching in schools, especially back then. You weren't teaching in schools that are somewhat diverse, like a lot of Oregon schools. Like there's diversity in them, but it's not really, the
Yeah.
stereotype of hardcore.
I'll tell you one more story that really resonated with me, and I was a brand new teacher. This was 1970, and I was teaching a history class. We had, and I was teaching the way I'd been taught, which was pretty traditional. And so we had taken a test over some material that I had given them, and then I gave them a test and graded the tests and handed them back, and I was walking around the room. I turned the tests over on each student's desk, and one of my African American students, I laid his test down, and just as I walked away, he turned his test back over, and it just had an F on it. And just in the middle of the class, he just looked up at me and he said, "Fuck you." And it was just that aha moment that, wait a minute, what I'm doing is not working. And that was, the good thing was, it was really early in my teaching career, and I knew I've got to figure out a way to make this more about relationships and relevance, and use that as a springboard toward a rigorous academic experience for these kids.
And just to kind of tie it all together, because I know you wouldn't say this about yourself, but he is widely considered, I think unanimously considered, probably the best principal in Canby High School history. I think anybody that I've talked to would argue that you were, pretty spectacular there.
Well, I was always about relationships and the power of relationships and how you can leverage those.
I was pretty young when you retired, but I can still remember a video that was made for you when you retired. There's some scene where you're walking through the hallways and you just like turn with a piece of trash and you throw it in a trash can and make the basket, and the whole hallway just like lights up. Like you were Steph Curry at a finals game. And that is just one of those little vivid memories that I have of that. But were there any other notes you wanted to add?
Well, I just took a few little notes that kind of brought back my thinking about culturally responsive teaching, and I really like the idea of language and culture as an asset and not a deficit. And I think in a lot of schools, it's that deficit model where people want to look at the fact that students have a different language and a different culture as their primary language and culture, and we see that as a barrier rather than an asset. And now we know in this day and age that being bilingual and bicultural is powerful, and you can utilize that throughout your life in a lot of different ways, including employment. I like the idea of empowering kids to be leaders of their own learning, and setting them up so that you can start from what they already know and what they're interested in, and be able to build the confidence through that so that they can then be able to move into more challenging academic work and feel like they can do it.
And that couldn't be more relevant than in math, basically. And that's why I've told you, and I've always talked about confidence being my number one, goal in math.
It's a huge factor. And I think another piece of it is getting kids to regulate themselves for learning. I think a lot of times when you go in classrooms, there are kids that just aren't ready to learn. And it's not that they don't want to learn, although some teachers interpret it that way, but they're just not ready to learn. So, how do you create that readiness and not imposing that, but helping them self-monitor and be able to get involved, engaged in the academic work.
I think that this basically proves that you were the perfect person to choose for this assignment, and we did have to, I think, cut a lot of corners just to make. I don't even know how long this has been going, but I assume that we're already at like the 10-minute mark, and we barely
Probably.
scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's a
So
lot we could talk about.
I also have a feeling that after the professor watches this video, she'll have no problem with me trying to use you for another critical reflection later, because you can definitely be a good resource for all of the topics.
I'd be happy to do that.
But, okay, well, love you, Dad.
You too.
And